You can rest now. The day is behind you. Whatever you carried. Thoughts, noise, unfinished conversations. You can set it down for a while. Let the waves in your mind grow still. Let the light inside you quiet. And listen, far off. Not here, but drifting just at the edge of imagination. There is a coast, not warm or welcoming, not like postcards or summer novels. It's wild. Jagged stone cliffs rise out of black water, scraped by wind and foam. The sky is a dull pewter gray, not stormy, but never calm. The gulls circle without hurry, and the air tastes faintly of salt and slate. And there, perched where the land ends and the sea begins, is a tower, not tall like a castle. It's not grand like a cathedral, but steady. Stone laid upon stone, rising just high enough to hold a light where it matters most. A lighthouse. Its walls are cold, damp, and slightly uneven under your hand. Its windows are small and clouded from decades of salt, and inside, somewhere moving slowly up a spiral staircase, is a man. He is not a sailor, not a captain, nor a merchant, not even a fisherman. But they all depend on him. You've likely never heard his name. His story doesn't make it into books. There are no monuments for men like him. He's a keeper of the light. Every morning he wakes before the sky. Every evening he climbs the stairs, checking the oil, cleaning the glass. He listens for foghorns and distant bells. He writes careful notes in a leather-bound log. And he is alone. The sea is his clock. The wind is his only neighbor. Some days, he sees no one. For weeks at a time, not a single human voice. Just seals watching from rocks, waves crashing like breath, and the ever-turning rhythm of the lamp. This is a life few remember. A life not built for glory, but for duty. Not fast-paced, not exciting. Just steady, constant, dimly lit. Tonight, we visit his world. You won't need your phone. You won't need to know the year or the tide chart or where exactly this place is on a map. Just imagine yourself inside that tower. A low flame flickers behind thick glass. The stone steps spiral upward, worn by boots and time. There's a thin line of soot around the lantern room. And somewhere nearby, a kettle whistles gently on a small iron stove. You are safe. The door is bolted. Storm is far out to sea. Tonight we will explore the quiet life of those who watched over the edge of the world. We'll begin with a day in the life, what it meant to wake, to tend the light, to sleep with one eye open for storm or shipwreck. Then we'll drift into history, to the builders, the engineers, the first brave souls who placed towers in the sea. We'll venture further into the fog of mystery, where myths and disappearances whisper through the stones, the Flannan Isles, the ghost logs, the sound of footsteps on an empty stairwell. Finally, we'll glance inland, to the world that never noticed, to the parlor rooms and city streets where men in warm coats signed pay slips for lives they'd never live, where the light was taken for granted, the man behind it forgotten. So take a breath. Let the modern world slip from your shoulders. Let the glow of the screen fade to a softer hue. Let your jaw unclench. Let your hands rest. Outside, the sea is endless. Inside, the lamp burns low. The journal is open. The pen is waiting. And the waves, like a lullaby, crash again and again and again. Let us know where in the world you're listening from tonight. It's always comforting to see how far these quiet stories reach. If you'd like more gentle journeys through forgotten history, consider subscribing now. Let's begin. The stairs are narrow. The oil is heavy in its tin. The fog is coming. The keeper is already at work. The door creaks. The lamp hums. The sea waits. The mornings begin before the light. Long before the sun reaches the edge of the horizon, he is already awake. There is no alarm. Only the soft rhythm of the waves below, and the subtle change in air pressure that creeps through the stone walls of the tower as night begins to lift. The chamber is small, circular, with walls of rough masonry and a single narrow slit of a window facing the sea. The air inside is always damp, heavy with salt and cold even in summer. The blankets, thick and scratchy, smell faintly of lanolin and smoke. His body rises slowly from the cot, stiff from the chill, joints aching just a little more than the day before. There is no fire burning yet. It's only a few glowing embers in the iron stove. He keeps his movements slow and measured. There is no need to rush here. The ocean is not going anywhere. The floor beneath his feet is uneven stone. He pulls on thick wool trousers, the kind that itch no matter how long you've worn them. Then a coarse gray shirt, hand-mended in 3 places, and a heavier knit sweater on top. His boots sit by the door, cracked leather with salt rings rising like faded tide lines. Before anything else, he puts on the oilskin coat. Always the coat. Outside, the wind hums low and constant, threading itself around the tower like a lullaby only the sea can sing. There's no bird song yet, just the occasional lonely cry of a gull still tucked somewhere in the rocks. He lights a small lamp with a practiced hand. The flame is weak at first, then steadies. Its soft glow flickers across the stone wall and faintly illuminates the spiral staircase that curls upward like a snail shell. The first task of the day is the climb. Stone steps rise in a slow coil from the base of the tower to the lantern room above. They are worn smooth in the middle from years of boots and slick with condensation in winter. One hand trails along the rope that acts as a railing, rough and familiar. The climb is silent but never truly quiet. Somewhere deep in the masonry, the tower groans with the shift of wind and tide. At the top, the lamp sits still. The great lens, framed in brass and glass, is cold now, its light extinguished just before dawn. He checks the clockwork, the weights, the gears. Everything is where it should be. He wipes the condensation from the glass with a soft cloth, then turns to inspect the oil reservoir. There's a rhythm to this, a checklist not written on paper, but in the body. He knows it by heart. Downstairs again, kettle filled. A few scoops of oats into a pot stirred slowly over low heat. A tin cup filled with water from the rain barrel. He sits at the small wooden table, facing the window, or rather, facing the fog beyond it. On most mornings, there is nothing to see but a gradient of gray. Sky and sea blurred together until even the horizon disappears. A spoonful of porridge, plain, a slow sip of tea, and then the log. Every day, the weather is recorded. Wind direction, estimated speed, visibility, sea state. A few notes on any passing vessels, though often there are none. If the foghorn was used, that is noted too. The journal entries begin formal, precise, but the older ones often trail off, as if the words themselves were too tired to continue. Sometimes, on long stretches without visitors, the handwriting changes. It wavers, spacing shifts, grammar stumbles. A mirror of a mind slowly unmoored by silence. Midday comes not with a bell or a chime, but with the gut-deep knowledge that it is time. Time to climb again. Time to inspect the lamp. Time to wind the weights that turn the lens. Time to polish the brass. It is always time for something, but never for noise. Lunch, if it can be called that, is bread that has gone a little hard and cheese wrapped in waxed cloth. Sometimes fish, dried and salty, too long on the shelf. He eats while standing. There is no reason to sit again. The rest of the day stretches like the sea itself, flat, colorless, and quietly endless. He might walk the perimeter of the tower, checking for weather damage. He might scan the sea with a spyglass, but mostly he listens. To the wind, to the groan of the stones, to his own thoughts, circling like gulls overhead. The late afternoon brings the ritual of the light. He ascends again, the climb slower now. At the top, he checks the mechanism once more, refills the reservoir, trims the wick, cleans the glass, just in case. The sun begins to set behind a veil of mist. The tower falls into shadow, and then flame. A match is struck. The wick catches. The light grows. When with a few turns of the crank, the lens begins its slow, deliberate rotation. Pulse of light and darkness. Light and darkness. Heartbeat for the sea. He stays a while in the lantern room. The wind is picked up now. A low roar beneath the turning beam. It sounds like breathing. The kind that comes in sleep. As night wraps around the tower, the fog thickens. The horizon vanishes. Only the light remains, carving a slow circle through the dark. Back at the table, he opens the log again. A final note. Light lit at 7:42. Visibility low. Sea moderate. No ships sighted. He closes the book. The stove is warm again. Removes his boots, then his coat. He drinks a small cup of tea, strong and bitter. There is no music. There is no voice. Just the echo of waves below and the steady blink of light through the tower window. He climbs into bed, blankets pulled high, the stone wall against his back. The world is quiet now, except for the sea. Always the sea. And above him, the lamp turns on, and on, and on. The climb to the lantern room is a ritual, not hurried, but purposeful. Each step echoes softly, swallowed by stone and sea air. At the top, the air is cooler. It always is. The windows are rimmed with fine salt crystals. The great lens stands at the center like a silent guardian, tall, still waiting. He begins by checking the oil reservoir. The brass canister is heavy, rounded at the sides, with a screw-top lid worn smooth from years of handling. He lifts it gently, listens to the slosh within, then unscrews the cap and peers inside. Whale oil once, then later paraffin. Thick, slow-moving, pungent in its own way. Not pleasant, but necessary. He tops it off carefully, steady hands, not a drop wasted. Oil is precious. Oil is what keeps the light alive. Next, he turns to the lens. It is a Fresnel lens. Imported, expensive, intricate beyond what most would imagine for a tower so remote. Its glass ridges catch the fading light from outside, scattering it into thin rainbows on the lantern room walls. He wipes it gently with a soft cloth. Worn linen, folded twice. The cloth has its own scent. A faint mixture of oil, brine, and thyme. He moves with patience, dabbing away soot and salt, careful not to press too hard. Each pane, each angle, is part of a system older than himself. Precision matters. Light bends here. Lives depend on its reach. With the reservoir filled and the lens polished, there is only one task left. The flame. He reaches for the match tin, a small metal box with a sliding lid. Inside, the matches rest like kindling soldiers, tips slightly grayed with age. He strikes one, flares, then steadies, and he lowers it slowly into place. The wick catches. The flame flickers, then swells, then holds, and now. The lamp is lit outside. The fog is creeping closer. He can't see it, not yet, but he feels it, in the pressure behind his ears. In the way the gulls grow quieter, in the absence of faraway waves, fog always announces itself in silence before it shows itself in form. Inside the tower, the lamp begins its long rotation, not fast. Just steady. Light, dark. Light, dark. It paints the inside of the lantern room in a slow-moving rhythm, a lullaby of shadows and shine. Down below, the spiral stairway flickers like a tunnel into some softer world. The lightkeeper stands for a moment longer, watching. Making sure the beam is smooth, unbroken, unwavering, or no applause, no cheers. But somewhere out there in the mist, a ship may be adjusting course. A captain may feel relief. A crew may breathe easier. And none will know the name of the man who lit the flame. But he knows, and that's enough. The light doesn't care if you're tired. Doesn't care about the rain or the cold or the wind that howls like an old sorrow outside the lantern room. The light must turn. It must shine, and it must be watched. So he climbs again. The steps are stone-worn smooth in the center, slightly concave where boots have pressed for decades. They spiral upward with no railing, just a heavy hemp rope bolted to the inner wall. He grips it out of habit more than need, fingers sliding along the coarse fibers as his boots fall into the same rhythm, step by step by step. He has climbed these stairs hundreds of times, perhaps thousands. Sometimes with urgency, sometimes with dread, often with nothing more than the quiet pull of duty. And always he carries something. Today it's the oil canister brass, dented slightly near the handle, warm to the touch, even in the chill. Its contents slosh softly with every movement. Whale oil, in earlier years, thick and pungent, the byproduct of lives taken far out at sea. Later, paraffin. Lighter, clearer, easier to handle. Still, it clings to the air and stains the cloth if spilled. The climb is harder now than it was 10 years ago. His knees speak more loudly on the fourth turn of the stair. His back tightens when the canister is full, but he does not complain. There is no one to complain to. At the top, the lantern room greets him with the faint temps of burnt oil and metal. The lens, towering, beautiful in its way, stands motionless for now, waiting for dusk. The gears below are coiled tight, the weight system ready to be wound again. But first, the wick. The lamp's burner assembly is old, but solid. He opens the housing carefully and pulls the wick from its collar. It's blackened at the top, frayed, slightly curled, soaked in residue. He trims it with small brass scissors, steady fingers cutting it clean at an angle. Too long, and it will smoke. Too short, and the flame will stutter. It must be precise, like everything else in this job. Quiet work, unseen work, but important. Once the wick is trimmed, he cleans the soot from the inner casing, soft cloth and slow circular movements. The soot is stubborn, clinging like old thoughts, but it comes away eventually. Black smudges stain the cloth, and still he wipes, gently until the metal gleams again. Then comes the oil. He lifts the lid on the reservoir and pours, tilting the canister slowly to avoid splashes. The smell is unmistakable, acrid and sweet at once, heavy in the nose. He watches the level rise until it reaches the marked line, then sets the canister down with care. A spill up here could mean disaster, fire, a failure. And failure in this world might mean someone does not make it home. With the reservoir full and the wick trimmed, he checks the gears next. The weight-driven mechanism is simple but brilliant. As the weight descends through the hollow of the tower, it powers the slow rotation of the lens, like a music box made of stone and glass. He winds it with the crank. Slow, even turns. The gear, teeth catch, engage, begin to hum with potential energy. The lens shifts slightly. It is ready. All of this done in silence. The only sound is the wind outside the windows, the soft creak of the brass fittings, the occasional thud of a gull against the pane. The keeper says nothing. He hasn't spoken aloud today. Maybe not yesterday either. Words are reserved for the logbook, and even there, only what's needed. As the sun begins to sink, he lights the flame. A match strikes against the tin. The hiss, the flare, the quick breath of fire. He lowers it to the wick, and it catches. A slow bloom of orange that steadies into a quiet glow. The lamp is alive again. The Fresnel lens begins its revolution. Smooth, inevitable. The light breaks into a beam, magnified and shaped by the precisely curved glass. It arcs across the sea, sweeping the horizon with every slow turn. Light, shadow, light again. Like a second heartbeat in the chest of the world. He steps back, watching for a long moment. Making sure the pattern is correct, the beam is clean, the timing precise. The sea answers only with its breathing, the steady inhale and exhale of surf against rock, and then the descent. He climbs down with the empty canister, his hands still faintly smelling of oil and brass. His boots touch the floor of the main room with the same soft thud they always do. He doesn't look back. The light will turn without him now, but it will not turn forever without him. It will need him again tomorrow, and the next day, and the next. This tending, this act of constant quiet vigilance, defines the rhythm of his life. There are no weekends, no interruptions. Only wind and fire, glass and oil, and the slow descent of weight and time. Sometimes he thinks of the men who built the lamp, the engineers who calculated each angle of the lens, the sailors who watch for its beam, the widows who wait at ports, all of them invisible here, but present, somehow in the turning light, and so he tends it. Again and again, climbing the stairs, refilling the oil, trimming the wick, wiping away the soot, because someone has to, because the sea never sleeps. A quiet dive into the lighthouse keeper's only written companion, the logbook, and how it captures both duty and slow unraveling. The logbook is never far from his reach. It rests on the small table near the eastern window, where the morning light first filters in through the mist. Bound in cracked leather and smelling faintly of sea mold and ink, the book is thick, its pages yellowed, slightly warped by moisture, and stained at the edges from countless fingertips, dusted with soot and salt. It is not a journal in the way most would imagine. There are no sprawling confessions, no sweeping thoughts about the meaning of life, not at first. It is, above all, a record, and records must be kept. That is the rule. Each morning, after tending the light and eating what could generously be called breakfast, he sits down at the table with the stub of a pencil and opens the book. The handwriting is precise, small block letters, every date underlined, every entry beginning with the weather, cloud cover, wind direction, temperature if the mercury is behaving, visibility, swell height, notes on wildlife, ship sightings. He writes it all in silence, the only sound the scratch of pencil on paper and the distant churn of the sea. Winds NW by W moderate, swell light. Rain early, now mist. A line, then another. Herring gulls in large number on southern rock. One skiff observed at 0730, headed east. Early pages are clean, ordered almost clinical. They resemble the man himself. Tidy, responsible, deliberate. But as the months pass, the entries shift. They loosen. Punctuation softens. Sentences stretch or vanish. Where a period should be. A word repeated. A line scratched out entirely and not replaced. He notices this distantly, as though the log were being written by someone else. Perhaps it is, because what begins as duty begins to blur, slowly, gently, into something else. The record keeping remains, but it expands. A note about the gulls becomes a paragraph. The skiff sighting includes speculation. Maybe the same man from last month in Redcap. On fog-heavy days, when the view stretches no farther than the base of the tower, the entries grow reflective. No ships sighted. Heard nothing but wind for 4 hours. Lamp still steady. There are days when the book is the only thing he speaks to. A strange comfort. Talking to the future. To someone who might one day read his words, flipping slowly through the pages while the sea pounds outside. It gives the silence form. Gives the time shape. Eventually, he begins to include fragments of thought that don't belong to the lighthouse. Not technically. Dreamt last night of dry land. Missed my father today. The gull with the broken wing has not returned. He writes them without thinking, hand moving on its own, as though pulled by the gravity of solitude. The handwriting changes too, subtly at first, slanting slightly more to the right. Letters crowding together or drifting apart. The pressure of the pencil less consistent. The pages begin to look weathered from within. The man is in the book now, not just his observations, but his mind, his drift. The longest entries often occur on the quietest days. No ships, no fog, no drama, just him and the lamp and the sea. The lack of interruption becomes its own kind of space to think or forget. Some pages hold more blank than writing. Others are packed tightly, words fitted together like stones in a wall. The margins are filled, the spacing inconsistent. It's not that he's forgetting how to write, he's simply forgetting how to write for anyone else. And still, every day, he writes. He writes when the ink runs thin and the pencil breaks. He writes when the cold numbs his fingers and he has to hold the book under his coat to keep it from stiffening. Writes on nights when the storm shakes the glass and the lamp feels like it might blow out. He writes when the fog is so thick that the lantern S-beam vanishes just inches beyond the lens. The log becomes a form of tethering, a quiet insistence that the world outside still exists and that he is still in it. There is no audience. There's no one to verify his entries or praise his consistency. But one day, when the relief boat comes, the log will be reviewed. It will be archived, stored somewhere inland, probably unread. Filed under a date and location, stacked beside dozens just like it. But that doesn't matter. The act of writing is the ritual. And like the tending of the light, it must be done. At the end of each entry, he signs his name.
Oh, just initials now.
Neater that way, faster. RM, or sometimes just R. The final entry of a long stretch might read simply, light lit at 1947, winds calm, no ships sighted, slept poorly, sea loud tonight, and that's enough. The sea does not demand poetry, just witness. As evening falls, he returns to the lantern room to inspect the flame. Then he descends the stairs once more, past the echo of his own footsteps, back to the table where the log remains open. Sometimes he adds a final note, a thought that would vanish by morning if not written down. He sharpens the pencil to a careful point, writes one more line. Lantern steady, fog returning. I am still here. Then he closes the book. And the page, like the light above, waits for tomorrow. There's a kind of silence in the lighthouse that doesn't exist anywhere else. It's not the silence of peace, or stillness, or rest. It's the silence of repetition, hearing the same wave crash against the same rock at the same angle over and over again, until you no longer register it as sound, but as part of the air itself. Time doesn't stop here, but it stops making a fuss about itself. Meals come when hunger suggests them, not when a clock strikes the hour. There are no meals in the social sense, just acts of necessity, a tin plate, a loaf of hard bread, nearly impossible to break without soaking it in tea, salted fish, cured long ago and packed in waxy paper, chewed slowly while staring at nothing in particular. Sometimes there's jam when the supply boat has been generous. Sometimes there isn't. He eats standing up, sitting as for the evenings, or for writing. His jaw moves slowly, methodically, as if chewing were just another maintenance task, like trimming a wick or winding the weight that turns the lens. Occasionally he speaks aloud, not in conversation exactly, but as punctuation, a quiet mm in reaction to the cold. A murmured observation. Once in a while, a word of thanks before a meal, though no one hears it but the gulls. Ah, the gulls. They're the most consistent company. Sharp-eyed, sharp-voiced, utterly indifferent to the affairs of men. They land on the railing outside the tower's narrow window and stare in with the impassive gaze of a creature that has nothing left to learn from humans. He watches them back, names a few, tracks their comings and goings in his head. There's one with a torn wing feather he's seen 4 times this month. It limps along the outer wall, leaving faint prints in the moss. The rhythm of days is defined less by action than by presence. Presence of waves, of wind, of gray. The sea does not change much. It just shifts its mood. Some mornings it slaps the rocks with spite. Other days it simply sighs. But always it is there. Always watching like the gulls. He begins to match its rhythm, not deliberately, not with intent, but through exposure, through time. The hours stretch, thin as fishing line. He reads, sometimes. Books passed down from the last keeper, pages swollen with moisture, words fading into fuzz. He reads them slowly, savoring not the content, but the break in routine. A paragraph here, a chapter there. Sometimes a single sentence read 3 or 4 times before it sticks. Other times he walks the path around the base of the tower. A narrow ring carved into the grass and stone by decades of boots walking the same tight circle. It's not for exercise. It's not even for thinking. It's just something to do. The boots crunch softly over gravel and he counts his steps without realizing. He doesn't mind the solitude, not really. What he minds is how icily he forgets that the rest of the world is still turning. That somewhere beyond the fog, people are rushing to carriages, kissing cheeks in doorways, burning dinners, and quarreling over newspapers. These things feel fictional here, imagined lives from another plane of existence. And when the fog settles in thick, it feels like the lighthouse has been untethered. Floating in a sea of mist, disconnected from land, from logic, from time, finds comfort in the small routines. In scraping old wax from a candle holder, in sweeping the same bit of dust that always returns beneath the table leg, in replacing the wick, even if it could last another day. These are the rituals that keep the silence from stretching too far, from becoming something else. Because when the silence stretches, the mind wanders. Why he once thought he saw a ship through the fog, dark sails unmoving just on the edge of visibility. But when he turned back a moment later, it was gone. Or perhaps it had never been there. It's hard to know. Solitude plays tricks like that. At night, he sits by the window, watching the beam of the lantern turn, casting light across the sea in a great slow circle. He times it by heart. 7 seconds between flashes. A heartbeat. A breath. Sometimes he imagines someone out there watching it from a ship. Someone grateful. Someone whose name he'll never know. That thought helps. Other times, he watches the moonlight creep across the wooden floor, hour by hour, until it vanishes again. In sleep, there are dreams. Some are vivid, of land, of warm bread, of voices speaking his name. Others are just fog, colorless and unformed. He wakes often. It's not from sound, but from a kind of inner tug. as if the sea were reminding him of its presence, even while he rests. And when he wakes, there is no confusion, no disorientation, just the same room, the same stone. It's the same breath of salt air curling through the tiny window slit. Tomorrow will be the same, as will the day after, and the day after that. And yet somehow, that sameness does not feel like a trap. It feels like purpose, quiet, unnoticed, and steady. Just like the light, the wind changes at night. Not louder, necessarily, but fuller, broader. It wraps itself around the lighthouse tower like a living thing, pressing against the stones, slipping through the cracks, humming low in the iron rails and rusting hinges. There's a sound to it that's hard to name. Not a whistle, not quite a roar, more like breath. The breath of something ancient and patient, exhaling slowly across the sea. Inside the lantern room, high above the cold earth and the darker sea, the light is turning. The flame has been fed, the lenses cleaned, the gears wound. Now the lamp completes its quiet orbit again and again. Every few seconds, a beam of warm gold cuts through the fog, sweeps across the blackness, and disappears, then returns, and vanishes again. It's a rhythm. Mechanical? Yes, but not without grace. Like the pendulum of a grandfather clock, while the steady rise and fall of sleep. The keeper stands with one hand resting lightly on the metal frame, eyes following the beam as it curves across the glass. There's nothing to see outside. It's just the gray void of mist and water. But he looks anyway, out of habit, out of hope, out of something deeper. The instinct to watch, even when nothing changes. There is no sound in the room but the wind pressing against the panes and the gentle tick of the rotating mechanism. Even the flame is quiet now, a thin, unwavering point of light cradled in its brass chamber. Sometimes the wind brings with it the scent of distant rain. Sometimes it smells only of salt and cold and emptiness. But tonight, it smells of stone. The kind of smell that comes when the damp finally finds its way inside and settles in the bones of the building. He knows that scent well. It means a long night ahead. He checks the reservoir once more, though he knows it's full. Runs a hand along the edge of the housing, fingertips catching on a small nick he's meant to file down for months. Then he lowers himself onto the small wooden stool set against the wall. It's not comfortable, but comfort is not the goal. It's only presence. There is no one to talk to, no one to check in with, no radio. No bells tonight, just the lantern and the sea. It is thoughts. At night, thoughts behave differently. They don't come in neat lines or orderly concerns. They drift like fog, soft at the edges, difficult to grasp. They move in from nowhere, wrap around familiar memories, and vanish again. He thinks of his mother sometimes. Of the last village he passed through before the assignment, of the man before him, whose initials are still scratched into the underside of the stool. WJ 1878. He doesn't know what happened to him, most likely reassigned. It's possibly retired. Or maybe he simply faded from this place, like everything else that he built from stone and light. The beam passes again. 7 seconds. Then darkness. Then light. He closes his eyes for a moment and listens. Not for ships, though that's part of it, but for anything. For the world reminding him it still exists beyond this tower. What he hears is the same as always. Wind, glass, breath, and the turning of the lens. Outside, the waves are hidden, but their movement can be felt in the bones of the tower. It's a low, steady rhythm, like the heartbeat of the earth. The tower sways ever so slightly, barely perceptible unless you've lived here long enough to feel it. He has. In this place, thoughts lose urgency. There are no arguments to replay, no plans to make. Only questions that rise without pressure and dissolve without answers. Will the storm shift? Did I hear something last night? Or was it a dream? Would I notice if I were slowly becoming someone else? But these questions are not troubling. They simply are. Like the tide, like the turning light, like the cold that never truly leaves. He stands again, walks one slow circle around the lamp, checks each pane, runs his cloth over a smudge that isn't really there. The flame flickers once, almost in greeting, then steadies again. The journal waits downstairs, but he won't write just yet, not until the last inspection is complete, not until the lamp is fully his again. He watches one more turn of the light, then two, then three. The fog presses closer, and so do his thoughts. Not loud, not sharp, just present, just floating outside. The sea wind howls, a low, endless breath rolling over the cliffs. Inside, the flame burns slow and steady. And somewhere in between, the man sits in silence, guarding a world that may have forgotten him, but a world he has not forgotten. The light turns, the fog thickens, and the night begins again. Long before the keepers ever lit their lamps, someone had to build the towers. And in Scotland, more often than not, that someone was named Stevenson. The Stevenson family left a legacy not in ink or song or battlefield triumphs, but in beams of light cast across black water. Warning ships from jagged rocks. They were engineers, not aristocrats. Builders, not poets. But they shaped the Scottish coast in a way that still endures, through stone, steel, and a relentless defiance of the sea. At the heart of this legacy was Robert Stevenson, born in 1772 in Glasgow. Orphaned young, he was raised by a stepfather who happened to be an engineer of some local renown. The path seemed almost inevitable. By his 20s, Robert had found his calling, constructing lighthouses where no one else dared to build them. And Scotland had no shortage of dangerous places to mark. Its coastline, long serrated and often shrouded in mist, was a mariner's nightmare. Storms rolled in from the Atlantic without warning. The waters were unpredictable, the rocks unforgiving. Each year, dozens of ships were lost, men drowned, cargo scattered. Families waited at harbors for vessels that would never return. One reef in particular stood out, Bell Rock, just off the coast of Angus. Submerged most of the time, it was a deadly trap. Invisible at high tide, waiting silently beneath the waves. Shipwrecks were so common there that the locals spoke of the reef in the same way they spoke of storms or fate. It was simply part of the sea's cruelty, but Robert Stevenson believed it could be tamed. In 1807, after years of lobbying, planning, and design, construction began on what would become the Bell Rock Lighthouse, a marvel of early 19th century engineering, and one of the oldest surviving sea-washed lighthouses in the world. The task was nearly impossible. The rock itself was only exposed for a few hours each day. The rest of the time, it vanished beneath the tide, unreachable. Supplies had to be ferried in carefully. Workers had to scramble to secure materials before the sea returned. And storms, always storms, threatened to undo a week's work in a single night. The men who worked with Stevenson on Bell Rock lived aboard a moored vessel or in temporary shelters perched on scaffolding, lashed to the reef like seabirds clinging to a cliff. They labored in the cold, soaked to the skin, laying stone upon stone by hand. And yet it stood. Finished in 1810, the lighthouse rose 115 feet above the sea. Elegant, whitewashed, defiant. Its lamp was first lit on February 1st, 1811, and it has shone almost continuously ever since. Even now, centuries later, it continues its nightly vigil. Bell Rock was only the beginning. Over the next 5 decades, Robert Stevenson and his descendants, most famously his sons David, Alan, and Thomas, designed and oversaw the construction of dozens of lighthouses throughout Scotland. They became known as the Lighthouse Stevensons, and their work stretched from the southern edge of the mainland to the furthest reaches of the Shetlands. Each build brought new challenges. The lighthouse at Skerryvore, completed in 1844 by Robert's son Alan Stevenson, was among the most daunting. Built on a remote rock in the Inner Hebrides, the site was exposed to unrelenting Atlantic weather. Construction took 7 years. The sea destroyed the worker barracks twice. Supplies were lost. Men were injured. But in the end, the light was lit. These projects were more than engineering feats. They were acts of stubborn faith. Faith that man could outlast the sea. That a foundation could be laid where only waves had ruled before. And behind every plan, behind every blueprint and carefully placed stone, was the burden of knowing what would happen if the light failed, if the tower cracked, if the wind won. The Stevensons were not reckless. They were exacting. They tested every material, obsessed over angles, stone weight, lens placement, ventilation. A lighthouse wasn't just a building. It was a tool, a warning, promise. It had to endure not just storms, but decades, centuries even. They knew that these towers would be home to men. Men who would climb those spiral stairs in the dark, would fill the lamps, clean the soot, wind the gears. Men who would sit for hours beside the flame while the sea screamed outside. So the Stevensons built well. They built towers that looked elegant in daylight and unmovable in storms. Towers that still rise from sea-washed rocks, still blinking into the night. They built for the keepers, for the sailors, for the wives who waited on the shore, and in doing so, they changed the map of Scotland. Not through conquest, but through light. The sea doesn't forgive carelessness, neither did the lighthouse boards. To be a keeper was not simply a job, it was a code. A way of living carved as cleanly into the soul as the towers were into the rock. It demanded quiet excellence, precision, restraint, and above all, presence. You did not drift through the days as a keeper. You showed up in full, no matter the hour, no matter the weather. Because the light could not go out, not once, not for any reason. In the 1800s, Scottish lighthouse keepers served under the watchful authority of the Northern Lighthouse Board, and their expectations were clear. Not grand. Not open to debate, just exacting. The rules were laid out in a small printed volume known simply as the Manual of Duties. It was carried to every post, placed on every desk, and referenced like scripture. Dabbers read it, lived it, and in many ways became it. The manual left no room for interpretation. The light must be lit punctually each evening and extinguished each morning as daylight permitted. The lenses must be cleaned daily. Oil levels checked, clockwork mechanisms wound, lamps trimmed, soot wiped from every brass edge. Weather observations were to be recorded hourly, wind direction, strength, barometric shifts, sea state, visibility, cloud cover. These logs, while mundane, formed the memory of the tower, a continuous record of the keeper's watch. But beyond the tasks, there were expectations of character. And here is where the code went beyond mere procedure. Keepers were to be sober at all times. Alcohol was strictly forbidden in the tower. It's not just during the shift. It's not just in excess. Entirely. A single lapse in judgment, a single missed light due to drink, could cost lives. The lamp was not a suggestion. It was a lifeline. And those responsible for it had to be clear-eyed, steady-handed, and utterly reliable. There were no parties. No visitors outside designated inspections. no distractions permitted. Lighthouse life was intentionally sparse, both to reflect the seriousness of the role and to reduce temptation. Even reading was monitored. Religious texts, scientific volumes, or practical manuals were acceptable. Novels and sensational materials were discouraged. The board didn't want fantasy, they wanted focus. Appearance mattered too. Uniforms were plain but proper. The tower had to be kept tidy, orderly, swept and polished, even if no one would visit for months, because to tend the lighthouse was to hold the line between safety and danger, between order and chaos. And that line could not be smudged by neglect. Keepers were inspected without warning. An inspector from the mainland might arrive unannounced, checking every logbook, every surface, every behavior. He might examine the wick for trimming marks, feel along the lens for dust. Ask the keeper the exact time of last maintenance, and expect an answer without pause. A failing mark didn't just mean a reprimand, it could mean reassignment to a harsher post, the loss of a bonus, or even dismissal. But for most keepers, the code wasn't a burden. It was a point of pride. Many of them were former sailors, used to hard conditions and long periods of silence. They found solace in the structure, a life stripped down to its purpose. There was comfort in the routine, in knowing that what they did mattered, even if no one ever said thank you. Some developed rituals. One keeper began every day with the same line in his log, "Light still true." Another always folded his cleaning cloths the same way, edges precisely aligned as if to impose order on the endless gray outside. They spoke little of feelings. Stoicism was a shared language. Complaints were rare, confessions rarer still. But in the small notations, the careful loops of handwriting, the consistency of their reports, you could read the quiet pride, the integrity. To live by the light was to believe in something greater than comfort. It was to believe in duty, not a duty to a superior, but to the sea, because the sea does not bend, does not reason, does not forgive a missed light, a dirty lens, a late inspection. And it certainly doesn't pause for a man nursing regrets or rum. So the keepers followed the code, not to please their superiors, but to honor the trust placed in them, by captains steering blind through fog, by families praying for their sons to return, by the quiet knowledge that somewhere someone was watching for their light, and when they died, as all men do, it was often without fanfare. A short note, a replacement dispatched. The lens kept turning. But if you ever stand on a cliff edge in the Scottish dusk and see the beams sweep once, then vanish, then return, know that someone once stood in silence to keep it burning, not for recognition, but because they believed they must. Most nights, the light turned without incident. The flame held, the lens spun, the waves broke, unseen below, and nothing happened. That was success. For a keeper, the best kind of night was the one where no one needed to remember you were there. But the sea is not always so cooperative. There were nights when the wind didn't just rattle the glass but screamed, tearing across the waves with a force that tested stone and iron alike. Nights when the rain didn't fall but slammed sideways into the tower, seeping in through every imperfect seam. When thunder rolled not above but around, bouncing between cliffs and sky like the voice of something enormous and angry. And on those nights the lamp still had to burn. One man, alone in a storm, was responsible for the safety of all who sailed nearby. When something failed even briefly, the results could be catastrophic. One of the most haunting truths of lighthouse keeping was this: you often wouldn't know if your failure had killed someone. The sea kept its secrets. Ship might be lost miles from shore, with no survivors, no reports. If the light went out for 10 minutes, or dimmed in fog, or spun unevenly from a wound gear. You might never find out what it caused, only that you failed, that you didn't, but feared you had. There were exceptions. One storm in 1865 battered the Isle of May lighthouse, so fiercely that it cracked a window pane in the lantern room. The keeper, soaked and nearly blind from flying salt and oil, managed to hold the flame by shielding it with his own body, pressed against the broken glass for hours until the wind calmed. His hands blistered, his coat ruined, but the flame lived. At Skerryvore, a winter gale once rocked the entire tower so hard that the iron staircase inside was torn from its mountings. The keepers were forced to huddle on the ground floor as the storm shook the tower like a reed in the surf. For 2 nights they couldn't reach the lantern room, and for 2 nights the light went dark. Ships were warned to avoid the coast. Some did. One didn't. Wreckage washed ashore days later. Timber splintered like driftwood. No bodies. Just a broken compass and a nameplate, found tangled in seaweed. Not every tragedy was so dramatic. Some came quietly like the cold. At Duhardach, a remote lighthouse west of Mull, a young assistant keeper fell ill during a harsh December. The sea was too rough for the relief boat. The other man on duty tended the light alone for over a week, while his companion faded slowly in the sleeping quarters below. By the time help arrived, it was too late. The journal entry for that day read, "Light lit. Winds northwesterly." Claren did not wake. There were also failures of design, mechanical oversights, not human error. In the early years, the oil used in lamps was notoriously fickle. Whale oil thickened in the cold. Wicks burned unevenly. A clogged nozzle or misaligned lens could reduce visibility by half, and a poorly maintained light wasn't just dim, it was deadly. Inspectors would sometimes find residue on the lens, or wick ends too short, or oil reservoirs low. These weren't just maintenance issues, were potential causes of death. And yet, despite all the rules, all the training, all the pride, there were still moments when the light went out. The causes varied. Storms, accidents, illness, and once a keeper simply vanished. At Cape Wrath, in 1881, a passing steamer reported the lighthouse was dark. A signal was sent inland. When the relief crew arrived by foot 2 days later, they found the tower intact, but empty. The door was bolted from the inside. The lamp was cold. The journal ended mid-sentence. The keeper was never found. Speculation swirled, as it always does. Madness. Suicide. A slip on the rocks. The sea does not return what it takes. But the tower stood. Within days, another man took the post. The lamp was relit. The logs resumed, as though nothing had happened. Because the sea does not pause for grief. And the light must always shine. These stories were rarely told loudly. There were no newspaper headlines, no national mourning, just quiet lines in official reports. Keeper deceased. Lamp extinguished due to gale. A delay in relief boat caused weather. But among the keepers themselves, these tales were remembered. Passed quietly, sheared in half whispers during inspections or supply runs. Not to scare, but to warn, to remind. That the ocean is always watching, that the margin for error is thin, that behind every light that turns steadily through the fog is a man, tired, alone, and entirely responsible, and that sometimes that light does go out. But when it does, another is lit in its place, because the job is not about perfection, it is about persistence. Time moves differently in a lighthouse. It stretches, folds, sometimes disappears. But one thing always pulls it back into shape: the relief boat. Every few weeks, in theory, a small vessel would make its way from the mainland, loaded with supplies, updates, and the simple promise that someone else remembered you were out here. The relief boat didn't just bring things, it brought connection, a breath of the world beyond the fog. But only when the sea allowed. The schedule was regular on paper, perhaps every 2 weeks, sometimes every 4. But in truth, the calendar meant little. If the winds turned foul, if the sea grew too rough, or the harbor too choked with ice, the boat simply wouldn't come. And there was no message, no call ahead, no certainty. Just a pair of eyes squinting across the gray horizon, day after day, wondering if the shape forming on the water was a ship, or just another hallucination in the mist. When it did arrive, the ritual began. A whistle from the boat, a wave from the bow, perhaps a shouted greeting, muffled by wind. The keeper would descend the tower, boots thudding softly on the stone steps, and open the heavy door that had remained shut since the last arrival. The men aboard the boat rarely lingered. Supplies were passed quickly. Crates of food, coils of rope, tins of oil, stacks of clean cloths, a new pencil, a bar of soap, once a mirror, and sometimes letters. Small envelopes folded with care, edges worn from travel, a sister's handwriting, a child's drawing. A short update from a friend. The hens are finally laying again, or your father coughs less now. Tiny glimpses into a life paused on shore. For a few minutes, the keeper would not be alone. The men might exchange a few words. Comments about the wind or the boat ride or some local gossip already outdated by the time it reached the tower. And then they would be gone, back into the gray. He would carry the parcels inside, set them down methodically, inventory them as required, then open them slowly as if to stretch the moment just a bit longer. The bread, soft, real bread, would be eaten that night. Even stale, it was a comfort, not like the hard tack that chipped teeth, not like dried fish or tinned beans. It reminded him of kitchens, of firelight, of home. The letters were saved for the evening, read by lamplight, twice, maybe 3 times, each word examined, each smudge studied, then folded again, smoothed gently, and tucked into a book or drawer, something to hold on to in the weeks that followed. The relief boat was also a marker of time, a place where days blurred together. Its arrival was an anchor, gave the mind something to move toward, the hope of fresh matches, of news, a proof that the outside world still turned, but sometimes no boat came. The weather turned quickly in those parts. What began as a light wind could rise to a gale in ours. The sea might go from calm to clawing in a single afternoon. And when it did, no captain would risk the crossing. Inside the lighthouse, the keeper would wait. At first, the delay was met with patience, a shrug, a note in the log, boat not sighted, likely weather delay. Then, by day 5, a little less patience. Bread gone, oil low, rain barrel not yet refilled, no more sugar for tea. By day 9, worry began to settle in. Not panic, just a quiet, grinding kind of uncertainty. How long before it came? How long before anyone noticed if it didn't? There were backup supplies, of course, emergency rations, a small keg of hard biscuits in a sealed box. But the real threat wasn't hunger. It was the erosion of time, the slipping of the routine, the dissolving of the line between one week and the next. A missed boat meant more than delay. It meant isolation without end date. The fog pressed closer. The journal entries grew shorter. The silence got heavier. When if the boat finally arrived, it often came without apology. Just a nod from the crew, a quick transfer of supplies, the exchange of short words, and then gone again. The keeper would return to the tower, arms full, boots wet, face unreadable, and life would resume. But something subtle always shifted after a missed relief. A slower walk up the stairs, longer pause before the logbook was opened. A distant look in the eyes, even when the kettle whistled again. Because the boat meant more than food, it meant memory. Validation. The sense that time still moved, and that he still moved within it. To most, the relief boat was a footnote, a line on a schedule. But to the man inside the tower, it was a thread stretched across the water, thin, fragile, but real. And without it, the light still turned, but the keeper turned a little slower. There are no statues for Robert Stevenson on the wind-swept cliffs of Scotland, no grand memorials in marble, no heroic portraits in gilded frames. But his legacy is everywhere. If you know where to look, it rises from the sea on jagged outcrops, stands firm against the Atlantic wind. It glows quietly into the fog. His legacy is built in stone. More than 80 lighthouses stand as a direct result of Stevenson's work and the work of his sons, grandsons, and their carefully trained engineers. Some are squat and weathered, their paint faded and flaking, their doors rusted with time. Others still shine with elegance, tall, clean, precise, standing straight against centuries of storms. All of them remain where they were planted, alone, purposeful, and silent. Maritime safety in Scotland changed forever because of these towers. Before Stevenson, ships often navigated by memory, luck, and prayer. Charts were inaccurate. The coastline was poorly marked. In winter months, the fog could be deadly. So could the tide. So could a single moment of hesitation. Shipwrecks were common. Death was expected. But then, the lights came. One by one, in the most dangerous places. Bell Rock, Skerryvore, North Ronaldsay, Du Hartog. Steady beams pierced the dark. The sea did not change, but man's place upon it became less fragile. Sailors learned to trust the towers. Captains adjusted course by the rhythm of the flashes. Fishermen knew when to stay out and when to come home. The lights became part of the language of the coast, as essential as stars, as respected as gods. And still, they made no sound. Even now, many of the towers built by Stevenson and his descendants remain. Some automated, some decommissioned, some still manned by a new generation of keepers or technicians. They have weathered gales and wars, recessions and revolutions, and they still stand, not because they were indestructible, but because they were built to last. The Stevensons approached lighthouse building as a sacred craft. Stones were cut to fit perfectly, each numbered, transported, and placed by hand. Foundations were laid on reefs where no man had ever stood long enough to dream of building. Materials were tested for years before being approved. Every angle of every lens was calculated. Every bolt, bracket, and beam chosen with purpose. And once the towers were complete, they were passed on, not just to the Northern Lighthouse Board, but to the men who would live in them, tend them, guard them. Generation after generation, keepers accepted the quiet responsibility. Some fathers trained their sons in the same towers, names repeated in the logbooks, instructions left in margins. Small tricks passed down, how to clear a stubborn burner, how to read a coming squall by the color of the foam. Not formal lessons, just quiet continuity, a line unbroken. And in that line, pride. Not the loud kind. Not the kind that needs medals or speeches. Just the quiet kind. The kind that keeps a man standing in the lantern room long after his shift has ended, just to make sure the light is turning properly. The kind that folds the same cloth in the same drawer in the same way, because that's how it's always been done. The kind that makes you feel part of something older than yourself. Even as technology advanced, as foghorns grew louder, as clocks grew more accurate, As automated systems began to replace human hands, the keepers endured. They adapted. They continued. Not because the world asked them to, but because the tower did. There is a particular silence inside a lighthouse. It's not the absence of sound, but the presence of history. Of footsteps that came before, of breath that once filled the same narrow stairwell, of eyes that scanned the same empty sea, wondering if the fog would lift before morning. When you enter one of Stevenson's towers, even today, that silence remains. You can hear the ocean differently there, more personal, less distant. And you can feel the weight of the structure. Not just its physical weight, but its meaning. This tower saved lives. A stone held against wind that tore roofs from towns. This light brought someone home. Robert Stevenson may be a footnote in engineering textbooks now, overshadowed, perhaps, by more dramatic figures. But his work speaks louder than most, not through volume, but through longevity, through relevance, through still being here. And so to do the men who kept his lights burning. They were not inventors, not kings, not poets, but their legacy shines just the same, one slow, sweeping beam at a time. Not remembered in parades, but remembered in every ship that makes it safely to shore. A legacy not written in ink, but in light. It begins with a silence. It's not the ordinary kind that wraps around a lighthouse in the dead of night, but something deeper. A silence that makes you stop mid-step. Silence that carries the weight of absence. This is the kind of quiet that greeted the relief crew when they landed on a landmoor, the largest of the Flannan Isles, in late December of 1900. The lighthouse was still standing. The lamp had been extinguished, as expected after daylight. The door was locked. The sea was calm. But inside, the keepers were gone. All three. The Flannan Isles lighthouse had only been operational for a year at the time. Perched on a remote island west of Scotland's Outer Hebrides, it was one of the most isolated postings in the system. The weather there was notoriously erratic, the seas unpredictable, and the cliffs unforgiving. The station was manned by a rotation of 3 men: Thomas Marshall, James Duquette, and Donald MacArthur, with a 4th man on leave. The system was simple. 2 men would tend to the tower while one rested. Every few weeks, the relief boat would arrive with supplies and a new rotation. But that month, the boat was late. Storms had delayed its journey. Nothing unusual. When the Hesperus finally reached the island on December 26th, the crew expected to find the men waiting with their usual routine: oil inventory, weather reports, some half-hearted jokes about the wind. But what they found instead was the beginning of a mystery that still whispers through sea fog more than a century later. There was no welcome. The flagstaff was bare. The gates locked. No one met them at the landing. Inside, the quarters were tidy. Beds made, oilskins hanging, a single overturned chair by the table. The kitchen clock had stopped. Outside, near the western landing, the ground showed signs of disturbance. A twisted railing, grass pulled from the soil, a large dislodged rock lying further up the cliff than seemed natural. But there were no bodies, no footprints leading away, no messages, no final entry in the logbook at least, none that explained what happened next. What the log did contain only deepened the mystery. Entries noted severe storms, high winds, nervous behavior. One line allegedly read, "Sea Comer, God is over all." But official reports later cast doubt on these entries, some suggesting they were exaggerated or added later. The most disturbing detail? There were no storms recorded in the area during the time the men were said to have gone missing. Nearby stations reported calm weather, no gales, waves large enough to reach the tower's height. And yet, something had taken all three men. Theories sprouted quickly. The most practical explanation was a rogue wave, a sudden massive swell that crashed over the rocks and swept the men into the sea. Perhaps one keeper went outside to secure equipment, and the others followed in alarm. A wave higher than any before could have taken them in seconds. But this theory left questions. Why was the door locked from the inside? Why were two sets of oilskins missing, but not the third? And why hadn't a single body washed ashore? Other theories leaned darker. Madness, paranoia. The island was small, and the isolation intense. One man, perhaps driven by weather or grief or something unspoken, could have turned on the others, then thrown himself into the sea. But again, no signs of struggle, no blood, no weapons, just nothing. Some suggested a supernatural element. The Flannan Isles were already wrapped in legend. The ruins of an old chapel sat not far from the tower. For centuries, shepherds avoided the place. Locals spoke of strange shapes in the mist, odd echoes, and lights that moved where no man walked. Some believed the island was cursed. It belonged to something older than the Lighthouse. Still others pointed to myth and folklore, selkies, spirits, sea creatures who lured men from cliffs with songs. It sounds like fantasy, and yet, in the absence of evidence, the line between myth and reason blurs. Officially, the Northern Lighthouse Boardus report concluded the men had likely been swept away by waves while attempting to secure gear during high winds. A practical answer. But even that answer carried doubt. Keepers since have visited Alen Moray and stood where the men once stood. They've walked the cliffs and looked out across the vast, endless gray. And many have said the same thing. It doesn't feel right. There is a stillness to that island. Not peace, but pause. Like the land is waiting for something, or remembering something it cannot speak. And even now, more than a century later, the story remains unfinished. No wreckage, no remains. Just a clock stopped mid-tick, a lamp without a keeper, and three names carried by wind and water. They lit the flame. They vanished. And the sea, as always, said nothing. Before there were charts and beacons, before Stevenson's towers dotted the coastline, the sea was something else entirely. It was not navigated. It was respected, not mapped, but feared, not explained, but listened to. Long before lighthouses cast their rhythmic glow across the Scottish shores, stories were passed from one generation to the next, told by firelight, whispered in harbors, murmured between fishermen as the tide rolled in. Stories of the deep, of things seen and things only felt. The sea was never empty. It breathed. It watched. It took, and sometimes it returned what it wanted to be known. Among the most enduring tales were those of the Selkies, shapeshifters of the North Sea, seals in the water and human on land. It was said they could shed their skins, walk upright, fall in love, and vanish again with the tide. Lighthouse keepers stationed on the remoter islands sometimes swore they saw figures on the rocks at dusk, pale, unmoving, just out of reach. Once, a keeper at Muckleflugger reported finding a seal's pelt tucked beneath a pile of driftwood. He left it untouched. A week later, it was gone. The stories say that if you steal a Selkie's skin, they cannot return to the sea. They remain on land, sorrowful, until they find it again. But if a man falls in love with a Selkie woman and hides her skin, well, he may keep her for a while, but never truly. Keepers, often alone for months, would sometimes imagine figures in the water, distant and sleek, not quite seal, not quite human. Whether it was loneliness or legend, the sightings continued. Journal entries spoke in cautious terms. Unusual movement at high tide. Shape vanished before confirmation. Then there were the sea spirits, older still, not creatures, but forces. The blue men of the Minch were said to dwell in the strait between the Outer Hebrides and the mainland. When calm, they allowed safe passage, but when angered by arrogance or disrespect, they summoned storms, capsized boats, and dragged sailors under. They were not visible in full, only in glimpses. Blue hands reaching from the waves, laughter in the spray. Some claimed the only way to survive their challenge was to answer their rhyming riddles on the spot. Fail, and your ship would sink. Even some lighthouse builders were wary of these spirits. During the construction of Scary Vor, workers reported tools vanishing, ropes fraying without cause, strange echoes bouncing off the rocks during calm mornings. A laborer once slipped and claimed he felt a hand, cold as slate, push him toward the sea. He was pulled back just in time. He never returned. The light itself in time became a source of legend. It was not always a comfort. Some said there were lights that should not be lit, ghost lights. Fishermen sometimes spoke of beams appearing where no tower stood. A sudden glimmer on a distant rock, blinking just once, then gone. A warning, or a lure. There were tales of ships chasing such phantom lights, steering toward them in storm or fog, only to crash upon unseen reefs. Survivors claimed the light danced ahead of them, just out of reach, like a will-o'-the-wisp at sea. Some believed these were the souls of lost keepers, still tending their post. Others said they were tricksters, spirits punishing those who forgot the old rituals, who set sail without offerings or prayers. And then there were the ghost ships. The most famous among them was the Cromarty Phantom, said to appear in the Moray Firth when war is near. A full-rigged vessel, black sails, no crew. It drifts silently, moving against the wind, vanishing the moment anyone tries to mark its course. Witnesses say it glows faintly, not golden like a lighthouse, but pale blue, like moonlight on ice. Lighthouse keepers, with their high vantage points, were often the first to see it. The logbooks rarely recorded such sightings. But in margins, in faint pencil lines, there are notes. Sails seen at 2 a.m. No sound. Vessel did not respond to signal. White light on western horizon. No explanation. These stories were never officially recognized. The Lighthouse Board did not concern itself with superstition. But among the men who lived in towers surrounded by fog and sea, the old stories never truly faded. A keeper might scoff during daylight, but come midnight, when the wind shifted and the gulls went silent, he might glance at the window just a bit longer. He might whisper a line of Gaelic his grandmother taught him, or light the lamp a little early, just in case. Because the sea is not empty. It never was, and the stories it tells are not always loud, but they are always there. In the flicker of the light, in the curve of a wave, the breath between one night and the next, lighthouses are not just structures. They're instruments of precision, shaped by stone and salt, built to endure the merciless moods of the sea. But over time, they begin to feel different. Not broken, not decayed, just inhabited in a way that stone shouldn't be. You can sense it when you enter the temperature changes slightly near the stairwell. Even though the draft shouldn't reach that far, the echo of your own footsteps comes back just a little off, like there's a second rhythm beneath it. A low creak when the wind dies down. The sound of something settling, or someone. To live inside a lighthouse is to live inside a giant ear. Every groan, every whisper of pressure against the glass, every expansion of wood under moisture is amplified and distorted. The spiral staircase seems to breathe with the tower. The lantern room contracts and exhales like the chest of a sleeping thing. In daylight, it's easy to explain. The metal expands. The stone cools. The wind changes. But at night, with the lamp humming overhead and the sea swallowing the world beyond the window, your certainty becomes less firm. Keepers over the years have noted strange sensations, feeling of being watched, not threatened, but observed, as if someone else was present in the room, just out of view. More than a few logs contain entries like, felt uneasy during final inspection, could not identify source. Stairwell creaked repeatedly with no wind present. Turned around. Nothing there. Some brushed it off. Others didn't. There are stories of shadows in towers with no flame lit. At the Mull of Galloway, Keeper reported seeing the silhouette of a man in the lantern room before he'd even reached the top. He climbed quickly, heart steady, boots deliberate, but found nothing. The room was empty. The lens had stopped, and the flame had died an hour earlier. In the journal, he simply wrote, "Possible internal reflection, relit lamp." He never mentioned it again. Other towers had reputations. At St. Abb's Head, it was said the stairwell never stayed silent, even when no one climbed it. The keepers, reluctant to speak openly, still admitted to hearing boots on stone at odd hours. Some believed it was the echo of former keepers. Others weren't so sure. One log, now archived in yellowed reeds, woke at 3:12, thought someone knocked. No one present. Door bolted. There's something about the design of these towers, narrow, enclosed, repeating, that seems to bend time inward. A spiral that loops back on itself, not just physically, but mentally. You begin to feel like you've always been here, like someone else always has. Even the architecture contributes to the effect. The lantern room windows, meant to magnify light, also distort the world outside. Fog warps the landscape. Reflections twist. It's not uncommon to mistake your own shape for something else. Taller, thinner, unfamiliar. And the sound. The sound can play tricks. The wind doesn't howl the same way twice. Sometimes it mimics voices. A moan low in the structure, our names spoken through the walls. Keepers with decades of service all report the same odd pattern. On windless nights, the tower is no quieter, just stranger. Whispers, one called them, like words that don't care if you understand them. Of course, none of this is in the official manuals. The Northern Lighthouse Board didn't include chapters on intuition or dread. But among the community of keepers, especially those stationed at the lonelier posts, these stories were passed on, quietly, respectfully, like you might disturb something just by saying too much. There were theories, residual energy. The tower, remembering the people who lived in it day after day for decades. Architectural acoustics, curved walls, bouncing sound in unusual ways. Simple isolation, the mind inventing company to fill the void. But none of those quite explain the entries in the logs, the subtle shifts in tone, the handwriting that starts to press harder into the page even when nothing dramatic has occurred. Some believe that the towers, especially the oldest ones, developed a kind of presence, not malevolent, not alive, just aware. A fellow keeper once said, "The tower knows when you're tired. It sighs with you." Another claimed his tower groaned differently depending on who was inside it, like it could sense the change. And some, in their final days at post, wrote strange and poetic things. Not instructions, not reports, but lines like, "There's something in the stones, not trapped, just listening. I no longer knock before entering the lantern room. Think it knows me now." These were never meant for inspectors. They were buried deep in personal journals, left behind in drawers, found years later by new keepers, and sometimes not at all. There's no formal record of hauntings in the Lighthouse archives, but the men who lived in them knew what they heard, what they saw out of the corner of their eyes, what they felt when they stood alone with the light behind them and the sea in front. The towers endure. They stand against storms, time, and tide. and perhaps they remember. There is a loneliness in a lighthouse that is different from other forms of solitude. It's not just the absence of people, it's the presence of repetition, the looping sameness of days, the rhythmic sound of waves that never pause. At first it feels peaceful, meditative even, but with time, the silence becomes its own kind of pressure, and it begins to press inward. Most keepers were prepared for the isolation, or so they believed. Many were former sailors, used to long voyages and empty horizons. Some were naturally quiet men, content with books, logs, and long silences. But even for the most resilient, something always shifted after enough time alone in the tower. It started small, forgotten thought. A phrase repeated to oneself a little too often. Counting steps not for exercise, but for structure. Naming seagulls. Naming shadows. The tower itself seemed to invite these mental loops. The spiral staircase. The rotating lens. The wind that returned in exactly the same rhythm each night. When you live in a place built entirely on cycles, your thoughts begin to cycle too. Some keepers coped by talking aloud, not to anyone in particular, but to the lamp, the journal, the kettle. Anything that gave shape to the silence. Few wrote letters they never sent, often addressed to people long dead. Others invented routines within routines, cleaning objects that didn't need cleaning, rearranging items on the shelf, even timing how long it took to make tea, just to feel a sense of control. But eventually, for some, the mind would begin to fill the gaps. There are accounts, not many, and never officially logged, of keepers who reported hearing voices that weren't there. Not hallucinations in the terrifying sense, but soft sounds, words too muffled to understand, whispers on windless nights. Sometimes it wasn't sounds. It was companions. A few logs make subtle references to invented people, an extra name mentioned during duty descriptions. A second cup poured, noted with a brief, set aside for J, out of habit. No J was ever assigned to that post. More than one keeper described seeing someone else in the tower. Not a ghost, not a stranger, but a version of themselves. Watching from a distance, sitting in the corner of the lantern room, standing by the door at dawn, not threatening, just present. It's hard to say whether this was imagination or something deeper, a result of the isolation, of sleep deprivation, of endless wind and sea eroding the boundary between the inner and outer world. In time, dreams and waking life began to overlap. Some reported difficulty distinguishing between what had happened and what had been dreamt. One man, stationed on a small reef tower in the Hebrides, claimed he once descended the stairs to light the lamp, only to find it already burning. His journal entry that night reads, "Either I did this already, or someone else has. It's not madness, not exactly. It's more like a dissolution. The self, after weeks without conversation, begins to feel porous. The line between one thought and the next softens. Memory loosens. There's no anchor in time. No one to reflect you back to yourself. You become slowly part of the tower, part of the routine, a moving piece in the great turning mechanism." Keepers who lasted long years learned to manage this effect. They developed mental exercises, read aloud, kept rigid daily schedules. Some even welcomed the strange mental fluidity, calling it a kind of fog within, mirroring the mist outside. But not all found peace in it. There were a few, very few, who requested reassignment not because of physical hardship, but because the tower had become too quiet, too alive, too entangled with their thoughts. One, in a letter never sent, wrote, "I wake sometimes and think I am the sea. I hear my thoughts crash like waves. I am not afraid, but I am not entirely here either. No official policy addressed this aspect of the job. The Lighthouse manual detailed lamp maintenance, storm protocol, visitor logs, but said nothing of the mental tides that came and went in the long nights. And so, the keepers navigated it alone. Some came through untouched. Others emerged quieter. Still others left behind journals that read like poetry or like riddles or like confessions in code. And through it all, the towers stood still. The flame burned. The logs were kept. From the outside, everything appeared normal, but inside, 1,000 small unravelings took place in silence. A voice answered with none. A chair moved a little to the left, without explanation. A man stared too long at the mirror and forgot, for a moment, which version of him was real. And still the light turned, because that was the one fixed point, the one unchanging pulse. In a world where time blurred and self could slip and dreams whispered back, the light stayed steady. It did not think. It did not speak. It did not drift. It simply turned. And perhaps for the men who watched it, that was enough. The lighthouse is a structure of practicality, a tool for survival, a warning signal, a calculated response to the indifference of the sea. And yet, from the beginning, it has always meant something more. There is something about a lone light in the dark that stirs us, even if we can't explain why. Across cultures, across centuries, the lighthouse has appeared not only as a physical guide for sailors, but as a symbol, a quiet metaphor, standing where certainty ends. In mythology, light on the water has always represented the boundary between worlds. In ancient Greece, the Pharos of Alexandria, one of the seven wonders, was more than a beacon. It was said to be a sacred flame, a bridge between the mortal realm and the divine. To see it across the sea was to know the gods still watched, or warned. In Buddhist texts, lamps placed on riverbanks symbolize clarity of mind, guiding the soul through murky thoughts towards stillness. In Celtic folklore, lights flickering on cliffs were often thought to be omens, sometimes of safe return, sometimes of sorrow yet to come. But nowhere is the lighthouse more layered than along the storm-swept coasts of Scotland, where the tower stands not just against waves, but against time itself. To the mariner, the lighthouse is hope, a light that says, keep going, you're not lost. In the thickest fog, in the blackest storm, the beam means, land is near, you will make it. It offers no guarantees, just direction. To the keeper, it is burden and purpose, a flame that must be fed, a rhythm that must never falter. It is a kind of vow, burning hour after hour, for ships that may never pass, for captains who will never know their name. A flame that says, even if no one sees me tonight, I will still shine. And in the mind of the lonely, the lighthouse becomes something stranger still. For the isolated, the exiled, the forgotten, it becomes a symbol of madness and memory. A mind turned in circles, a single room with one thought turning again and again. How many stories in film, in novels, and whispers feature a solitary figure staring out from the lantern room, not just at the sea, but into something within? The lighthouse is where people are sent when they must endure something. Grief, shame, silence. But within that exile is also power. Because the light reaches where the man cannot. It keeps going when he cannot. It speaks when he has grown too quiet. Even when automation replaced the keepers, the symbolism held, the light still turns, the towers still stand, and we still look to them. In modern poetry, the lighthouse often appears as the last flicker of memory, the one unchanging thing in a mind unraveling. In stories of trauma, the beam becomes the thread that leads back to shore. And in times of war, exile, or disaster, the image of a lighthouse remains shorthand for clarity amid chaos. But not all meanings are comforting. Some lighthouses, particularly those long abandoned, carry a different metaphor. That of obsession. A man staring too long into the dark, unable to leave. A flame that must be tended, even if it burns alone forever. The idea of futility cloaked in duty. In this way, the lighthouse is both redemption and ruin. A light for those finding their way, and a prison for those who can't find their way back. This duality is what gives the structure its strange magnetism. It's not just a tower, it's a question. Are you the ship or the keeper? Are you moving toward the light or trapped within it? There is an ancient Chinese saying, better to light a lamp than to curse the darkness. But what happens when that lamp is all you've ever known? For some keepers, the tower was salvation, a retreat from the noise of the world. For others, it became a mirror too honest to bear. And yet, the flame always remained unchanged, steady, impartial, undisturbed by meaning. That's the final paradox of the lighthouse. We project so much onto it. Hope, madness, solitude, clarity, and yet it doesn't ask for any of that. It simply turns. The beam sweeps, the flame flickers, and the tower endures. It does not care why you are lost. It does not demand thanks. It only asks that you see it and steer away from the rocks. Even now, in a world mapped by satellites and guided by GPS, people still photograph lighthouses. They still climb their spiral stairs. They still write stories about them, because something in us still recognizes what they mean. That we are all, at times, surrounded by fog. That we are all, in moments, looking for a light. That somewhere, even now, one still burns. While a keeper climbed the frozen stairwell of a storm-wrapped tower, while he trimmed a wick with shaking hands, or watched the fog devour the sea for the third night in a row. Somewhere else, far inland, a conversation was taking place in a warm and polished room. In Edinburgh, the intellectual heart of Scotland, and in London, its imperial brain. Decisions about the coastline were made by men who rarely heard the sea for more than a summer-esque breeze. They sat not on cliffs, but in salons and drawing rooms, the scent of waxed wood and cigars thick in the air. Here the light came from gas lamps, not oil-fed flames. The fog was poetic, not perilous, admired for its mood, not feared for its concealment. A mist light meant a line on a chart or a delayed insurance payout, not death, not driftwood, not empty chairs in coastal villages. The lives of these gentlemen were filled with structure, certainty, and comfort. In Edinburgh's new town, rows of Georgian houses stood in clean, perfect lines. Fireplaces crackled behind heavy velvet drapes. Decanters sat on sideboards. Newspapers arrived with the Morning Post reporting on storms that, by the time the ink dried, had already passed. London, too, had its rhythm. Parliament bustled with policy. Papers passed hands. And somewhere in a well-lit office, a junior official might check the log of lighthouse expenditures before moving on to the next matter of coal tariffs or canal maintenance. These were the men who governed the lights, who signed the pay orders, approved oil shipments, debated the curvature of lenses and the cost of stone. To them, the lighthouse was a number, a specification, a mark on a naval chart. They believed in it, but abstractly. It was a project, a line in the imperial ledger. Towers were important, yes, admirable even, but remote, sanitized by distance. The Northern Lighthouse Board, headquartered in Edinburgh, met in paneled chambers to review reports from the field. Minutes were taken, budgets debated, keeper performance occasionally noted, but always secondhand. Names were written in the margins, replaced without ceremony, transferred like inventory. Few in these rooms had ever climbed a tower in winter. Fewer still had felt a gale shake the lantern room or seen a gull's feather frozen to the glass. They didn't need to. Their hands were dry, neatly gloved or ink-stained, but untouched by salt or soot. They had tea with their decisions, and then moved on to other matters. Debates about maritime safety took place over polished tables, with maps spread flat and steady. The coast was a shape, a statistic. They spoke of commerce, of routes and tonnage, of the empire's shipping lanes, while somewhere a keeper was sweeping sea spray from the inside of a window. There was no malice in this distance, only disconnect, a world away from gulls and foghorns. For the elite, the idea of a lighthouse keeper was romantic, noble, a symbol of rugged discipline and national reliability. They told their sons to admire such men, just not to become one, yet they depended on them. Heavily, without the keepers, the trade routes would falter. Shipments would run aground. Letters from colonies might not arrive, but the men behind the flame were rarely invited into the room. If a keeper retired after 20 years, there might be a letter, a modest pension, a line in the local paper, but not a visit, not a seat beside the policymakers, because the keeper's life was viewed as something other. Honorable, yes, but far away. Like a painting on the wall, appreciated but not touched. Some of the board's members had family estates along the coast. From their windows, they could see the beam of a lighthouse sweeping across the sea. A comforting sight, but not a personal one. It never occurred to most to wonder who had lit that lamp, who had trimmed the wick, who had climbed the stairs in the rain. These were men who saw the light, but not the keeper. Meanwhile, in the tower, the keeper likely knew their names, saw their signatures at the bottom of letters, read their instructions, followed the guidelines they approved in their fine, neat handwriting. But those names didn't mean much when the fog came in early, when the storm blew in sideways, and the flame flickered and needed tending in the middle of a sleepless night. The men in the parlors governed the system. Just the man in the tower made sure it worked. And between them is the sea. Always the sea. There is a particular kind of silence that follows a letter that never comes. In the lighthouse, time doesn't pass in hours or days. It passes in boats and parcels. It's in envelopes folded by hands that feel further away each week. For most keepers stationed on remote islands or rock towers, communication with the mainland was slow, inconsistent, and often weather-dependent. A letter sent from a wife in Aubin or a daughter in Inverness might take weeks to reach its destination. Sometimes longer, sometimes not at all. And for the keeper, the wait was patient, but heavy. The post didn't come with a predictable ring or knock. It arrived with the relief boat, if the sea allowed it, and the sea did not care about birthdays, or holidays, or homesickness. So the keeper learned to hope without expecting. We would descend the tower when the boat finally came into view, boots already wet from spray. Supplies would be offloaded first. Oil, cloth, biscuits, maybe a new broom head. Then, at the very bottom of the crate, tucked between inventory sheets or inside a pocket of wool, there might be an envelope. He'd unfold it slowly, even if he had no intention of reading it just yet. Because the letter was more than words. It was a kind of presence, shadow of someone he could no longer touch. Some letters were long and careful. Updates on the household. Stories about neighbors. Hints at loneliness wrapped in polite lines. Others were short. Just a few sentences in a shaky hand, We're managing fine. The baby is crawling now. The cow is sick again. Father sends his prayers, and some letters simply stopped coming. It didn't always mean tragedy. Sometimes it was just the weight of distance. A life on land pulling forward while a life at sea stood still. The keeper would write back, of course, sitting at his table by the narrow window. The journal set aside for a few minutes, he would pick up a stub of pencil and a sheet of coarse paper. Weather fair, lamp working, oil sufficient. Miss you terribly. He would fold the letter carefully, tuck it into an envelope, write the name, always the same name, with steady, careful script, and wait for the next boat to carry it away. Sometimes it arrived. Sometimes it didn't. The delay itself became part of the relationship, kind of dance across weeks. One man thinking of a person who, by the time the letter was read, might have changed in some small but unknowable way. The child mentioned as teething might now be walking. The father, said to be recovering, might now be gone. The woman, once affectionate in her tone, might now feel the silence more than the bond. The keepers rarely said this aloud. They were men of duty, of structure. But the ache was there, in how long they lingered with the envelope in hand. And how many times they reread a line that felt just a little too formal. And how many times they wrote the words "all is well," even when it wasn't. Some wrote poems. Others scribbled fragments in the margins of their logbooks. Lines not meant for inspection, but for memory. She has not written, "Weather calm, fog thick this morning." I dreamt of her voice. It faded before I woke. I did not blame the distance. I only wish it were shorter. There were practical hardships, too. News of deaths often came too late to grieve in any traditional sense. A telegram passed through the wrong hands, delayed by weather. By the time it reached the tower, the burial had already happened. The keeper mourned in solitude beneath a lamp that could not afford his distraction. Some learned of births weeks after the child was born. Their own children, now breathing on land they would not set foot on for months. And still, the letters mattered, even when late, even when brief, even when they didn't come at all. The hope that they might arrive shaped the day. A man might sweep the lantern room more carefully the morning the boat was expected. He might shave, comb his hair, fold his uniform more precisely, as if to be seen through the words waiting in that paper. He might write a fresh letter the night before, just in case. Even though he had nothing new to say, just to remind them, I'm still here, still tending the light, still waiting for your voice. In this way, the lighthouse keeper's greatest burden was not the storm, but the stillness after, the not knowing, the waiting, the empty mailbox, the folded letter worn from too many rereads, the slow realization that some things, some words might never arrive, but still he climbed the stairs, still he lit the lamp, still he hoped the fog would clear. On the sea and in the space between himself and home, because to receive a letter was to remember that he was more than the tower, that he belonged to something and someone beyond the spray, even if only in words, even if they never came. Every lighthouse had two occupants, the keeper and the distant presence of the bureau. The keeper climbed the stairs, trimmed the wick, wound the mechanism, and endured the isolation. The bureau, whether in Edinburgh, London, or an administrative outpost, issued the instructions, tallied the figures, reviewed the logs. Together, they kept the system running. But they existed in different worlds. The lighthouse boards, such as the Northern Lighthouse Board in Scotland, were composed of naval men, engineers, and government appointees. They met in respectable chambers, rooms that smelled of ink and dust and carefully aged wood. Their tables were stacked with maps, fuel reports, and requests for paint or rope. To them, lighthouses were infrastructure. Necessary, yes, but impersonal. A keeper was a role, not a person. His well-being was measured in compliance, not contentment. Every lighthouse had its manual of duties, crafted and distributed by these inland minds. It told the keeper how to behave, what to wear, what to eat, when to log entries, how to trim the wick, how to sweep the stairs, how to speak to inspectors. The tone was calm, authoritative, and entirely devoid of empathy. It didn't mention grief or boredom or the way the sea sounds when it's about to turn dangerous. Inspectors arrived unannounced, uniformed notebook in hand, collar stiff, boots clean.
Ow.
They stepped into the tower like auditors at a bank, eyes scanning for known compliance. The keeper, without comment, would stand a little straighter. The journal would be presented, the lamp displayed, cloths checked for lint, the brass assessed for shine. They might stay an hour, sometimes less, then return to the mainland to file a report. Station in good order, keeper punctual, wick properly maintained. There was rarely a line for looked tired or hasn't spoken to another man in 20 days. The inspector was not cruel, it's just detached. That was the design. There were also committees, subgroups of bureaucrats who decided the materials used in tower construction, the number of turns required for a lamp lens, the precise beam angle needed per region. Some of these men had never seen a lighthouse in person. Many had never heard the sea in full storm. Still, they made decisions that shaped the daily life of the keeper. In one instance, a revised policy reduced the oil ration by 2 ounces per night, based on new cost estimates. The impact keepers had to monitor the flame even more closely, stretching the supply, hoping the wick would last till dawn. Another ruling determined that the color of uniforms should shift from navy blue to gray, not for safety or visibility, but for consistency with postal employees. The keepers complied, because that too was in the code. Obedience to the system. There was a hierarchy, an invisible ladder stretching from sea to suit. At the bottom, a man with a lamp. At the top, a man with a pen. Communication between them passed through layers. The keeper wrote his reports. The inspector condensed them. A clerk summarized that for the engineer. The engineer relayed essentials to the board. By the time the keeper's words reached anyone with real authority, they had been translated into data. Stripped of personality, a line might read. Requested additional oil rations for winter due to extended fog periods. But what the keeper actually wrote was, fog so thick for 4 nights I could not see the base of the tower. Flame dimmed too soon on second night. I feared a passing vessel might not see us. Requesting higher oil allowance before the next cycle. The fear was not transmitted, only the request. Sometimes decisions came back without explanation, a denial, delay, a reassignment. No context, just a change. A keeper might open a parcel and find a revised instruction booklet. New cleaning protocols. Note about changes in recording weather patterns. He would adjust, even if it made no sense at sea level, because the keeper was not meant to understand the why. He was meant to comply with the how. Still, many kept their own opinions, scribbled in private journals, or spoken aloud to the stone walls at night. One wrote, "If the man who said the wick should be cut to 2 inches stood here with me in this wind, I suspect he would reconsider." Another inspector noted dust on 4th stair. Wonder if he saw the gull with the broken wing sheltering on the landing. These notes were never sent. The Bureau liked things neat, ordered, predictable, and the sea is none of those things. The men who sat in city rooms believed in systems, in measurements, in the illusion of control. The men who lived in towers knew better, but they followed the rules all the same. Because while the Bureau might not have understood the lighthouse keeper, the keeper understood something deeper, that systems fail, but duty remains. That behind every distant decision was still a lamp to be lit, and that no matter how many forms were filed inland, it was the man on the rock, soaked, silent and unseen, who made sure the light turned. At the end of the month, a keeper's duties would be measured, checked, signed off, and a payslip would arrive, folded inside a brown envelope, carried by the relief boat, written in ink, stamped with official insignia. The amount was not large, it never was, in the mid-1800s. A head keeper might earn £45 to £60 per year, depending on the post, the remoteness, and the length of service. Assistant keepers earned less, sometimes half, often less than local tradesmen or school teachers or even dock workers in the city. For this modest sum, a keeper gave his entire body to the sea, his nights, his hands, his hearing, his joints. He gave his silence too, and often his health. The pay was considered respectable by the boards. It came with a small pension. If a keeper made it to retirement, it's not the family received a letter and a final check. Sometimes enough for a coffin, occasionally not. But the system saw the numbers as fair, balanced, adequate. It was, after all, a government position. There was even housing of a sort, stone quarters attached to the base of the tower, a shared kitchen, a cot that bowed in the middle, coal rations, a tin kettle. On some islands, a garden could be managed. On rock towers, there was nothing but rain. For many keepers, there was pride in the work, if not the wage. The paycheck didn't reflect the value of the job, only the system's estimation of what the job ought to cost. But value, true value, can be weighed in pounds and shillings when lives are at stake. It didn't account for the night a keeper stayed awake through a hurricane, checking the flame every 15 minutes. Or the storm where a supply boat never arrived and he rationed food for 12 days without complaint. Or the month he worked alone because the assistant fell ill and there was no one to send. It didn't account for what he missed. The births, the funerals, the years spent away from his children as they grew into strangers. The evenings when he stared at the same sea, knowing that far inland, someone else was sitting at a warm table, unaware the lamp even needed tending. But still, the paycheck arrived. It came with numbers that didn't insult, exactly, just numbers that didn't quite understand. The Bureau occasionally issued commendations. A keeper who showed exceptional conduct during a difficult storm might receive a note of thanks, a mention in a quarterly report. Very rarely a medal. Bronze, modest, often delivered by post. Sometimes there was a farewell notice. A brief sentence in the papers, Mr. James Craig, after 28 years in service to the Northern Lights, has retired from his station at Ardnamurchan. But mostly, the keeper left his post the way he had lived it, quietly without fanfare. His replacement would arrive with fresh boots and a set of instructions. The lens would keep turning. The sea would keep crashing. And the name of the man who once kept the flame alive would fade with the salt. There were those who stayed in service until their bodies gave out. One keeper in the Shetlands was found seated beside his logbook, pen still in hand, lamp still burning. Another, in a more distant post, was buried in a plot no bigger than a rowboat, the tower's only grave. No grand funerals, no marble stones, just the sound of waves, and a light that no longer needed him. And yet, for all the system's detachment, something remained. a deep, unspoken reverence among those who truly knew what the work required. Sailors, mostly. Coastal villagers, fishermen. They knew that the light didn't shine itself. That behind every safe passage was a man who climbed, who trimmed, who waited. And though few said it aloud, they trusted him more than the charts, because the keeper wasn't just a function. He was a promise. It's made flesh and habit and sleepless vigilance. And no matter how small the paycheck, that promise never failed. Eventually, the door closes for the last time. The tower remains behind, its spiral staircase, the smell of oil and salt, the cry of gulls against slate-gray skies. And the keeper returns home, not forever. Always. Some only left for a short leave, few for good. Retirement, reassignment, illness, or age, catching up with knees that climbed too many stone steps. But no matter how long the absence, returning was never quite as simple as packing a bag and boarding the boat. When a man lives with the sea as his ceiling and fog as his companion, land feels louder, brighter, edges too sharp, footsteps too quick, steps back into a world that has moved on gently but undeniably. The village recognizes his face. Perhaps, but his voice is slower now, less certain, and his presence feels like something from another time. He walks through streets he once knew, now dotted with new shops, new neighbors. Children have grown taller. A fence has been painted. A dog barks at him like he's unfamiliar. Even family feels slightly distant. Not in affection, but in rhythm. He sits at a dinner table and finds he doesn't know how to join the conversation. They speak of harvests, parish meetings, of a neighbor's engagement. He listens politely. He smiles. He nods, but inside, his mind is still with the wind, still counting waves, still wondering if the lamp is turning. Sometimes they ask about the sea. Was it terribly cold? Did the storms frighten you? What did you eat out there? But the questions come from curiosity, not understanding. And the answers he gives are gentle, edited, or softened like the wind before a storm. Because how do you explain months alone to someone who has never heard silence press against glass like that? So, many keepers say little. They nod. They sip their tea. They say it was quiet. They say it was routine. And then the conversation moves on. No one asks about the gull that kept returning to the same ledge, or the way the light bends in fog, so thick you lose your own reflection, or the sound of your own heartbeat after you've gone 3 days without speaking aloud. And in time, the keeper begins to fold back into land life, slowly, unevenly. He walks to the market, tends to the garden, pairs the hinge on the shed door. But something stays at the edge of his thoughts. A flicker, a rotation, like the lamp still turning, far out on the coast. And sometimes, on windier nights, he steps outside, stands in the dark, looks toward the horizon. And if he's lucky, very lucky, he might see the light. Just a flash, one beam, a quiet hello from the sea. No one else notices, but he does, because part of him never really left. Time does what it always does, even to stone, even to stories. By the late 20th century, the light no longer needed a man to tend it. Electricity, automation, remote monitoring. The sea was still dangerous, but the flame had become a button, a circuit, a scheduled flicker. And so, the keepers went away. One by one, the towers fell silent. No more boots on the stairs. No more oil cans or soot cloths. No more journals with faded ink. Recording waves, winds, and feelings, too quiet to share aloud. The lantern rooms still spun, but without the hands that once wound them. Some lighthouses remained in operation, cared for by technicians who visited by helicopter or boat. But they were no longer homes, no longer warm, even in their chill. Others were abandoned completely. On jagged coasts and salt-bitten cliffs, the towers now stand as ghosts in daylight, windows broken, doors rusted, ladders swallowed by moss. The sea continues its slow and patient work, pulling at the base, stone by stone, like a dog at a bone. Some are kept alive by preservationists, volunteers who repaint the walls, sweep the dust, restore the signal. Others quietly erode. No plaque, no ceremony, no final entry in the logbook. Just wind, just gulls, just the soft sound of waves against crumbling stone. The men who once lived in those towers are rarely remembered by name. Their pay records yellow in archives. Their reports rest in drawers no one opens. But their work, that remains, because the light continues. Even without the keeper, its memory is visible, in the rhythm it left behind, in the safety it once offered, in the unspoken comfort of knowing something, someone, was once there, watching, waiting, shining a path through the dark. When a sailor sees a beam sweep the sea, he doesn't think of the engineer, or the policy, or the bulb. He thinks of the lighthouse. And somewhere inside that word is the ghost of the man who once made it shine. Return now, just once more, to the stone tower. You don't need to climb the stairs this time. The oil can is resting. The journal is closed. The flame is steady. Everything has been tended to. You are simply here, in the quiet. The wind no longer howls. It hums. The sea no longer crashes. It sighs. The gulls are asleep on their ledges. The light still turns, slow, patient, timeless, out past the reef, past the waves, over a world that continues to drift, unaware perhaps of how much depended on this lonely tower. But here you know. You've seen the boots on wet steps, the hands polishing glass, the quiet ache of waiting for a letter that never came, the gull that returned every morning like clockwork, a sea fog that made the world disappear and come back again. You've seen the man who stayed when no one asked him to. You've felt the rhythm of isolation and the strange peace inside it. You've walked through storms, through myths, through silence, and back. And now, all of it is fading, not in loss, but in stillness. The stories may not be told often. The towers may crumble, but the memory remains, steady like the lens itself. It's never quite dark, never fully gone. Even tonight, far from the sea, some version of that rhythm still lives in you, in your breath, it's in your thoughts, in the quiet turn of memory and meaning. The sea is still there, the tower still stands, and the light still turns. So let the waves fade, let the light turn, let the journal close. You've kept the watch long enough. You may rest now.